Well, welcome everyone to the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange's student webinar series for the spring of 2025. My name is Eric Evanson. I'm NAFC's Science Communications Specialist. Now, the goal of this series is to connect students with the fire and forestry community and establish productive working relationships, as well as exchanging knowledge. And speaking of exchanging knowledge, I just wanted to point out that NAFC is part of the Joint Fire Science Program's Fire Science Exchange Network. There's 15 exchanges all across the country, like you see there on the map, all doing great fire science work. And if you want to learn more about what they do, as well as the Joint Fire Science Program, I encourage you to go to their website at firescience.gov. Now, today's talk is entitled Unraveling the Role of Plant Soil Fire Feedbacks in Driving Forest Mesophication and Climate Resilience. And our presenter today is Eva Legge from Syracuse University. Now, the way it will go is we'll go ahead and have Eva give her presentation, and then we'll follow up with a question and answer session at the end. If during her talk you have any questions, feel free to pop those into the chat, and then we'll follow up with that question and answer session. And then we'll conclude with a little discussion on the fall 2025 student webinar series that we hope will be taking place. And otherwise, let's, before we get fully started in today's presentation, why don't you put your name and your affiliation in the chat, and then we'll get started. All right, welcome, Amanda. Kevin, welcome. Thanks for joining. If you don't get your name and affiliation there, no big deal. We're grateful that everybody is in with us today. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and I'll turn it over. I'll stop sharing and I'll let Eva go ahead and talk a little bit about herself and then go into her presentation. So, and before that, I see Joseph's in. Thank you. Shlomaya's in. Thank you again for attending. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And Eva, if you want to go ahead, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. Okay. So, can everybody see my screen?
Yep,
awesome.
Perfect.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eric, for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here today and talk to you all about plant soil fire feedbacks. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you don't know what that is, because it's a new term that people came up with recently and we're trying to promote. And we'll get into that a lot more in just a second. But just to start out, my name is Eva. I am a first year PhD student at Syracuse University. And I'm so excited to talk a little bit about my research. A lot of this is going to be background because I am a first year, so I don't have tons of results yet, but hopefully it's still illuminating for you all. So just a broad overview of what I'll be chatting about today. First, I'll talk about the mesophication problem, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And then I'm going to transition to a potential overlooked driver of mesophication, little teaser there, and then go into my research aims. So to start off, I just wanted to introduce myself a little bit more. I am the granddaughter of a gardener. That's my grandmother, Baba there, and there's little me gardening. And growing up, I just fell in love with plants. And I went to undergrad at Dartmouth College, and I had the opportunity to do a lot of fun things, including yoga and mountaintops and playing jazz piano, but spending a lot of time in the forest looking at trees. And my graduate work is really at the same thing, trying to ask questions and do science that will inform management aimed at making our forest more resilient to myriad stressors that it's facing right now, which includes but is not limited to invasive pests, invasive plants, pathogens, acid rain, fire suppression, and of course, wildfire. So this all just to show a silly animation that our forests are undergoing a lot of uh, new and recurring stressors. And this picture was actually just taken, I believe, yesterday. And it is a picture of the wildfire in New Jersey that's been burning for the past few days that has consumed at least 15,000 acres, presumably from an improperly extinguished bonfire. And this isn't the only incident. Here's another photo of the Jennings Creek wildfire from last November that burned over 5,000 acres along the New York, New Jersey border. So this is not only a threat to our forests, but if you look right below here, in front of the advancing front of the flames, there's a whole bunch of waterfront homes. So this is a big concern for both forest managers and the general public. And they're making it known these extreme conditions are occurring all throughout the eastern US. And it's really putting a huge strain on our forests, which for the most part are not prepared for a fire of this caliber, both because we have seen a shifting composition of uh, forest types to more fire sensitive species, but also forests like the New Jersey pine barrens that might be fire adapted are experiencing fuel accumulation leading to these completely uncontrollable fires. But one headline that I found when I was looking through the news that I didn't quite agree with was this one. And it's from Vox that says it's not normal for the East Coast to be on fire. And while I agree that having these high intensity, completely out of control wildfires throughout the eastern US is not normal, the problem isn't that fire hasn't been on the East Coast at all. It's that these fires are increasingly intense and killing even fire adapted trees. And as I mentioned, a lot of trees in the Northeast might not be fire adapted. Um, so this graphic, I think, really takes home the point that fire is not at all new to the eastern US. So this is a model of the historic mean fire return interval from 1650 to 1850 CE, and more red as more frequent fires. So you can see that throughout the eastern US, fire is actually quite frequent, and for thousands of years, fire has had a prevalent role in the landscape through a combination of indigenous ignited burning and natural ignition. And this created a complex mosaic of ecosystem types that were maintained by more fire and composed of more fire adapted trees like oaks, pines, and hickories, um, which are all trees that a lot of managers are hoping to target for climate adaptation in the future. But you can see that our forests look quite different now. They're a lot more homogeneous and don't have this complex patchwork of different ecosystem types. And this is largely driven by um, fire suppression, from direct fire suppression in recent decades with Smokey the Bear, and also the cultural suppression and genocide of indigenous communities that really maintained frequent burning in this area. So these are some pictures of what historical forests might have looked like, covered in pine trees, chestnuts, different oaks. But we don't see a lot of forests like this anymore. What you're probably more used to is a forest like this that's closed canopy, a lot wetter. And this is driven by a process that is called mesophication, which is a positive feedback loop whereby darker, wetter, and cooler microsites promoted by fire's prolonged absence favor these more shade tolerant, drought intolerant, and fire sensitive trees that further perpetuate such conditions. So that is a bit of a jumble of words, but I think it's well encapsulated in this figure from this really landmark um, journal article by Nowacki and Abrams in Bioscience that I'm sure many of you have heard of, that shows the process of fire suppression leading to increased canopy closure, increased shade, and then the resurgence of shade tolerant mesophytic trees, which leads to decreased fuel flammability and due to mesophytic litter and cool humid microclimates that is becoming more prevalent as fire importance is decreasing in the landscape. So another way to think about positive feedbacks is a hurricane, because I know this process of mesophication can seem really complicated. So I like to think about it like this, that the bigger the storm gets, it sucks more water in, and at some point there's a regime shift and people are looking out from on shore, realizing that this, what once was a tropical storm, is now a hurricane, and there's some sort of shift that happens, and people get into new mode and have to prepare for it. And I think it's important to think about shifts in our forests in a similar way, because even though a hurricane obviously is on a completely different time scale, completely different effects than changes in forest types, they are both still positive feedback loops. And because this is on a much faster time scale with immediate catastrophic effects, people, I think, understand it a lot better, but that doesn't mean that this isn't a very concerning issue. And the farther along we get in this process, just like with a hurricane, the more momentum it gains. And so the harder it will be to reverse this process. So this is a really great graphic that my advisor over at ESF, Andy van der Yacht, made in his recent publication in Biological Conservation that shows that in the higher size classes of trees in the eastern US, this is from a compilation of forest inventory and analysis data in the eastern US, there's about an equal proportion of fire adapted and fire sensitive trees. But when you get into the lower size classes, there's a much higher proportion of fire sensitive trees. So once these fire sensitive trees like maples and beech start to take over the canopy and the fire adapted trees like oaks and pines die out, that's going to make it harder and harder to reverse the process. And it's going to make it harder and harder for fire to get on the ground as well. But it doesn't just mean that fire is less likely to be on the landscape. It also means that when it does hit, it will lead to mass mortality of the trees, both because there's a huge amount of fuel accumulation, but also that there's an increasing proportion of fire sensitive trees. So just as a summary of this part one, I just wanted to emphasize the main take-home points that, first of all, our forests are quite stressed out, as I'm sure you know already, and subject to increasingly intense wildfires that can degrade even fire-adapted forests. This is not because our forests aren't historically used to fire, but due to fire suppression. And this has happened over centuries, and especially in recent decades. This has led to a transformation of forests from historically fire adapted to ill adapted ones for future climates that are projected to have increasing drought, higher fire, just more extreme events in general. And data indicates that we may soon reach a tipping point, because this is a positive feedback loop, that reversing mesophication is going to become more and more difficult. So understanding the causes of this pattern is important now more than ever. So for part two, overlooked driver mesophication, big reveal, surprise, surprise. It is below ground interactions, and probably not a surprise to you since I am in a mycorrhizal ecology lab. But my research is really interested in taking fire effects on soil properties, both below ground interactions with different biota, but also with nutrient cycles, and incorporating it into the mesophication framework. Because as you'll see later, while it's implicated these above ground drivers, like microclimates and fuel flammability, nobody has mechanistically done research to try to draw in below ground fire effects into this framework as well. So that is what I'm hoping to help contribute to with my research. And I'm especially focusing on mycorrhizal fungi, which, if you're not familiar, they are really backbone to the world's forests. So just breaking down the word mycorrhizae, myco is Greek for fungus, rhiza is Greek for root. So the word mycorrhizae encapsulates the nature of this relationship between certain fungi and roots. And most trees on Earth form symbioses with mycorrhizae. And they exchange essential nutrients such as nitrogen, which is quite limited in eastern US forests and can become especially more limited with frequent fire. And they are enormously powerful agents of change by both improving a tree's stress tolerance, by transferring scarce nutrients and water to the tree, but also by engaging in their own positive feedback loops, which I'll get into in a second. That really could be at least a missing piece of the puzzle to explain mesophication and help inform management aimed at reversing it. And we have seen mesophication play out below ground. So just to preface, trees in the eastern US really associate with two main types of mycorrhizal fungi: arbuscular mycorrhiza, which you can see on the right-hand side of this diagram, which tend to associate with more fire-sensitive trees like maples. And what distinguishes these kinds of fungi is that they penetrate directly into the tree root. So this is a diagram of a root. I hope you can see my cursor here, but they penetrate directly into it, versus actomycorrhizae, which tend to associate with more fire-resistant trees like oaks and pines. And their distinguishing quality is forming this sheath around the outside of the root tip. Oops. And this graph on the right is also using forest inventory analysis data, but now it's to show a shift in below ground associations away from ECM fungi. So this paper was showing that in the last 30 years, with decreasing amounts of fire and also increasing amounts of nitrogen, because nitrogen, fire is not there as a means to volatilize it, so burn it up and bring it into the atmosphere, that this has created a shift in the below ground interactions away from trees that associate with more with actomycorrhizae, so these fire tolerant associations, versus arbuscular mycorrhizae. So this means it's really imperative to fold in below ground processes to our understanding of mesophication. And what's really important is that these trees and these below ground processes aren't just passively responding to fire suppression, but the lack of fire can lead to shifts in these associations. And then these mycorrhizal associations can then actively modify their environment to further push the dominance of their associates. So this is just an example of another positive feedback loop. And so this can lead to what we call an alternative stable state. So I gave an example with a tropical storm turning to a hurricane. But even when you take fire out of the mix, mycorrhizal fungi can lead to these alternative stable states. So just to break it down a little, because I know this can be really complicated, but this diagram here is showing the relative abundance of ectomycorrhizal associating trees. And so on the right here is 100% ectomycorrhizal associating trees. Again, those are more fire tolerant trees. And then on the left here, there's the 0%. So this is arbuscular mycorrhizal associating trees. So you can see there's a spike at 100% arbuscular mycorrhizal associating trees and 100% ectomycorrhizal associating trees, which means that these symbioses are engaging with their host to perpetuate their own dominance and create a regime shift towards either total dominance of one type or the other. So I showed this diagram in the previous slide, but this is showing how without fire, conditions can lead to a regime shift from one forest type to the other. But if these mycorrhizal feedbacks are further reinforcing this process, this might mean that it is even harder to reverse and might be a missing piece of the puzzle, as I mentioned before. So this really brings me into what I mentioned on the very first slide in my title, to what we're calling a plant soil fire feedback. So this is going to be the bulk of my PhD research, which aims at reconciling these two patterns, plant soil feedbacks and the above ground processes of fire fuel feedbacks that are discussed more with mesophication, and hoping to bring them all together into what I'm calling a plant soil fire feedback. So we are defining it as a complex feedback between mature trees, abiotic and biotic soil properties, and immature tree performance and fire that may drive mesophication under fire exclusion. So here's a simplified version of it. With historical fire regimes, fire is likely to affect soil in a way that promotes fire adapted trees over fire sensitive trees, but also due to positive feedback loops, both above and below ground, the fire adapted trees can further promote their own dominance through positive feedback loops. And then with modern fire exclusion, the lack of fire leads to changes in soils that can promote fire sensitive over fire adapted trees. And then again, these fire sensitive trees can engage in positive feedbacks to further promote their own dominance. So this is a little complicated, but this is our hypothesis for what's going on. So just to summarize, for part two, mycorrhizal fungi form a complex symbiosis with trees across the eastern US, and they play a pivotal role in plant soil feedbacks at a global scale. And while they may be a part of the problem in driving mesophication, they may also factor into our solution to this problem if we better understand the process. So with that, I'm going to get into my research. So my driving questions in my research are, what are the mechanistic below ground drivers of mesophication? And two, how can management create plant soil fire feedbacks that might reverse mesophication at a landscape scale? And since these ecological problems are quite complex and require a number of different approaches to fully understand, I'm taking a kaleidoscopic approach to my research through a combination of literature reviews, computer modeling, greenhouse experiments, and field experiments. So just to start out, in my literature review, I'm collaborating with Andy Vanderyacht as well as other partners at Michigan State and my advisor here at SU, Chris Fernandez, to understand how fire affects soils under historic fire regimes and under fire exclusion, and how these shifts in soil properties affect fire adapted versus fire sensitive trees. Um, and also, an important part of this is to assess research gaps and avenues for future research. So, I've mentioned this before, but the bulk of research on mesophication has focused on the above ground drivers of this process. So, with historical fire regimes, fire opening the canopy, creating these hotter, drier, sunnier microclimates, is sparse or vish stories dominated by pyrophytic, so fire adapted trees like oaks and pines. Um, that makes it easier for fire to get on the ground and also increases fuel flammability because the hotter and drier microclimates are allowing the fuel to dry out. And this further promotes pyrophytic trees over pyrophobic trees. But also, the actual nature of these trees, the way they grow, can alter microclimates to be even hotter, drier, and sunnier, and can also alter fuel flammability. For example, while maple leaves tend to retain a lot of moisture and lay flat, uh, oak leaves can tent and curl, leading them to dry easier, and fire can stay on the ground. So this is undoubtedly an incredibly important feedback that's driving historical fire regimes. Whereas under modern fire exclusion, lack of fire on the ground is creating these dense overstories dominated by pyrophobic species. So again, maples and others, other species like beech that are leading to cooler, wetter, and darker microclimates, and also lower fuel flammability that's further promoted by pyrophobic trees producing litter and creating these conditions. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't things happening below ground. So our work is synthesizing a number of papers out there to show that frequent fire leads to dramatic changes below ground that interacts with these above ground feedback loops as well, and we think is a very important part of this process. So I know this diagram is a little complicated and scary, but I'll try to break it down a little bit. We broken it down into four main categories: that fire overall leads to decreases in soil moisture, also can decrease pathogens that um, can colonize these pyrophytic trees, and also lowers soil nutrients and can interact with fire adapted mycorrhizal fungi, all of which tend to benefit pyrophytic trees. And I really want to highlight this nutrient mycorrhizal interaction because this is incredibly important part of it. That fire, as I mentioned, can volatilize nutrients, lead to overall losses in nitrogen, especially. And pyrophytic trees tend to thrive in more nitrogen limited environments and can outcompete pyrophobic trees. But in addition, the fungi that pyrophytic trees associate with also can outcompete the fungi that pyrophobic trees associate with. So it's incredibly important to understand these below ground interactions. And then in the absence of fire, there can be an accumulation of pathogens on pyrophytic trees, a overload of nutrients and soil moisture that allows pyrophobic trees and their associated fungi to outcompete pyrophytic trees. I'm more than happy to revisit this and answer any questions that may have come up as well. So we're hoping we've written this up. It's been taken a while to wrap our minds around it, but we are nearing a resubmission of this manuscript, which is exciting. And then another project I'm just ramping up is working with Randy Swati and other members of Conservation Data Lab over at the Nature Conservancy to more empirically tie shifts in fire return intervals with shifts in mycorrhizal types in the eastern forests. And we're going to do this with a very powerful state and transition modeling tool called Landfire to map current ecosystem types and fire return intervals. So the rationale of this work is that the overall contribution of plant soil fire feedbacks to mesophication over the past 400 years is really poorly understood, although we have the data to investigate it. So the amazing thing about this tool is that they have a vast amount of data on both historical ecosystem types and fire regimes, and also present day conditions. So my main driving question is, how does change in fire return interval pre-colonization to now contribute to the loss of fire adapted ectomycorrhizal associations? And my working hypothesis is that the decrease in the average fire return interval over time has yielded a decrease in percent ectomycorrhizal dominance. So I will have more updates on that in the future, but very beginning stages now. I'm just starting to learn GIS, which is a whole new beast for me. So third, I just wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about the greenhouse experiments I have set up. So I have one experiment running right now and another one in the works that is really working to get out the mechanisms behind plant soil fire feedbacks, trying to specifically tease apart the potential biotic below ground contributors and the abiotic contributors. So I'm working in collaboration with Jennifer Goss Microbial Ecology Lab over at SUNY ESF, which is just our neighbor across the way, and partners at the Albany Pine Bush to understand how fire frequency affects both biotic and abiotic soil properties, and to promote the success of fire adapted trees like pines over at the Albany Pine Bush. So I'll get a little more into this complicated diagram, but first I just wanted to show you my driving questions, which is, first of all, how fire frequency affects soil community composition of mycorrhizal fungi and other microbiota in the system, and how fire-induced changes in soil chemical and biotic properties can contribute to the success of pines. So my working hypothesis is that pine seedling success, which can be encapsulated by their growth, survival, and foliar nutrients, will be optimized at a high fire frequency due to its effect on mycorrhizal fungi and their interaction with nutrient availability. So this experiment is happening over at the Albany Pine Bush, which is right near the heart of downtown Albany, and an incredible organization that's been implementing prescribed burns for decades. So we identified 3 frequently burned, 3 infrequently burned, and 3 unburned stands. Here's the last unburned control. And we sampled soil at 10 points within each stand. So here's a picture of the different treatments. So we determined fire frequency in relation to the fire history in this particular area. So frequent fires are fires that have burned at a somewhat regular interval since Albany pine bush first started burning, which I believe is in 1988. Hopefully nobody's fact checking me on this here. But so that led to frequently burned areas being burned approximately 5 to 6 times in the past 25, 35 years. And then the infrequently burned plots would burn closer to 3 or 4 times. And then the control plots have not been burned in Albany pine bush history. And you can see the stark difference in control plots, how they're completely overgrown, infrequent, are slightly more open. And oops, this is supposed to say frequent. My apologies for that. And just a note, this is a very unique inland pine barren system. And when I think about mesophication, I think more about oaks and maple competition because this is a very unique system. But I think it's very interesting to ask these questions. And I think that the lack of fire can still create similar feedbacks, but it's going to be a slightly different regime shift than you'd see throughout the whole eastern US. So I just wanted to note that. So in November of last year is a beautiful day. We had a crew out sampling soil, as I mentioned, 10 points in each plot, with amazing help from partners at the pine bush, which you can see the picture here. And then lots of soil processing. I brought a whole bunch of bags of soil back to the lab. And what I did was I planted little pitch pine seedlings in them. So again, this is a little bit complicated, but we have two experiments running concurrently. So there's a biotic feedback experiment and a nutrient feedback experiment. So you can see on the left, the biotic feedback experiment. We took all the soil from all the different burn treatments and mixed them all together and put them in an autoclave, which blasts these soils with extreme heat and pressure. Right down the hall from here, it's very scary. It just melted a plastic tray in my lab. Maybe accidentally put it in there. But then we amended this with live soil that was a little bit of soil that was homogenized by fire treatment. So a little bit of live soil added to the top of this from the frequent, infrequent, and control. So this allowed us to isolate the potential biotic effects of frequent fire because this sterile soil that composed the bulk of the pots was overwhelmingly the majority, and then just a little bit of live inoculum. Whereas in the nutrient feedback experiment, we have sterile soil that makes up the bulk of the experiment, but it's only homogenized by burn frequency treatment. So there's a whole bunch of sterile soil from the frequently burned plots. And then we put a little bit of mixed inoculum live soil on top. And for each of these 6 treatment levels, we have 12 replicates. And here's a little picture of me with my seedlings. So we put these, this experiment launched on February 5th. And so it's been almost 3 months. So they're all doing well. Maybe 2 or 3 have died, but it's really fun visiting them each week. They're just right upstairs in the greenhouse and watering them. So we don't have results yet on how the seedlings are responding, but once the experiment ends, which will be in August, as long as they don't outgrow their pots, we're going to dig them all up and see what kind of fungi are colonizing them and look at how they're responding. So we're going to look at the nutrients in the needles, and we're also going to look at changes in biomass, root to shoot ratio. And we're waiting, hopefully in a few weeks, we'll get some preliminary data on the soil fungal communities as well. So I performed DNA extractions on the soil so we can see how burn frequency affects mycorrhizal community structure. But we do have some initial data showing that with a higher burn frequency, so the orange is the frequently burned, the pink is the infrequently burned, and the green is the control plots, that there is lower available nitrogen, which is incredibly exciting because, as I mentioned, active mycorrhizal fungi, which are associated with these fire-adapted trees like pines, really excel at obtaining nitrogen when it's scarce. And it does this by getting at organic pools of nitrogen, which is not what we call plant available. And I'll get more into that in a minute. But this is showing that inorganic nitrogen is really decreasing with more frequent fire. So since the pines are associated with fungi that are really good at getting at nutrients when they're scarce, it means they might be able to outcompete other species. So we also found lower soil moisture like we predicted in the higher burn frequency plots. We're still waiting on other soil analyses, total C and N, although my collaborators in the Goff lab did find total nitrogen to be lower as well in the higher burn frequency plots, which is cool. And they also found significant differences in pH of the soil, which, as I'm sure you all know, has enormous consequences for trees and their relative success. So stay tuned for more updates on that in the future, but hopefully by the end of the summer, I'll have some more exciting results on that. But in the meantime, I'm ramping up for a slightly larger scale greenhouse experiment. This was, it's a fun project, but I was considering it as a slightly pilot project for this, where we're hoping to, as I mentioned, the Albany pine bush is an incredibly unique inland pine barrens, and so results can't necessarily be generalizable to broader trends throughout the eastern US. But what we have seen throughout a lot of the eastern US is oak decline and competition of maples. So I'm hoping to look at this more broadly generalizable mesophication byproduct that will begin this summer. So again, it will the same overarching approach, but kind of factoring in this oak and maple competition and how oaks may create plant soil feedbacks that can lead to their relative success over maples, and how maples might also create positive feedback loops as well. And so we'll be sampling soil from 3 levels of burn frequency again, down in Pennsylvania over at Fort Indiantown Gap. And we're also considering other areas as well to make this more broadly generalizable. So please reach out if you have potential sites that you'd be interested in. And so this is what we're currently proposing as the mechanisms that might be driving pyrophytic tree and over pyrophobic tree success. So with this experiment, we'll try to look at every facet of it. So this is a lot, but this is showing that with increased fire frequency, we expect there to be lower or inorganic nitrogen, which we did see in the previous experiment. Higher nitrogen that's bound in what we call pyrogenic, aromatic organic matter. So this is organic matter in the soil that's really hard to access biologically, but there's evidence that especially actomycorrhizal fungi might be able to access it. So overall, there's lower soil nitrogen availability, which will lead to a promotion of actomycorrhizal symbiosis over mycorrhizal symbiosis because actomycorrhizal fungi, as I mentioned, can access organic nitrogen better, which will lead to the promotion of pyrophytic over pyrophobic trees. And then what we expect is that these pyrophobic trees will engage in these positive feedback loops to further promote their own dominance by um, enhancing the representation of their actomycorrhizal symbionts and increasing this enzyme activity to further get their trees nitrogen. So we expect the opposite to occur with lower fire frequency, leading to more nitrogen accumulation, more nitrogen availability, um, fewer enzymes for organic nitrogen acquisition, which leads to arbuscular mycorrhizal symbiosis and pyrophobic tree success. So we're going to, this is part of a, I just wanted to throw in this figure that we're including in a proposal right now that would hopefully allow us to do all these different analyses that you see in italics. So we're really excited about this. And this is the overall schematic of the experiment. So again, we would take soil from frequent, infrequent, and control plots in the field and run similar soil biotic and abiotic tests and see what changes with fire frequency. And then we would plant both maple and oak in separate pots in the soil that again is either isolated for fire effects on biota or isolated for fire effects on abiotic properties, and then grow the plants for 6 months, and then transplant a new generation of plants into it to see if the first generation has changed the soil properties and create these positive feedbacks to promote conspecific dominance. So we'd expect, say, in the biotic feedback and the frequently burned plots, for oaks to perform better because fire is selecting for more beneficial fungi for oaks. And then the oaks change the soil properties to accumulate more beneficial symbionts. And so then in the second generation, the oaks would do a lot better than the maples. And then in the control plots, we'd expect the maples to do better because there's more beneficial fungi for them. And then for them to further amplify their fungal symbionts the first year. And so then they would be more successful in the second generation as well. So I'm more than happy to talk about this and take any suggestions or potential site recommendations. This is still very much in the works, and a lot of ideas on how to make it happen. So just wrapping up here, I wanted to briefly mention that, as I'm sure you all know, there's instances in which it's just infeasible to have fire on the ground due to biological, political, social reasons. So I'm also looking at ways we can use timber management as a tool to potentially simulate fire effects on, microclimates and canopy structure, and promote the dominance of future adapted trees. So I'm doing this up in the Adirondacks and seeing how harvest intensity affects below ground soil properties and how those shifts might promote red and white oak. So I can't get into that more now, but happy to take questions on that. And then finally, I'm also looking at ways we can use fire to um, promote chestnut, um, American chestnut regrowth, which is considered to be a more fire adapted tree as well. So I'll look at changes in fungal symbionts as well. But in a matter of time, I'll just have that be a little teaser, but I'm very excited about it. Um, and move on to the most important part is all the incredible people that have helped me make this happen, from other members of my lab over at Syracuse to collaborators over at SUNY ESF and amazing volunteers, folks at the Albany Pine Bush, and collaborators at Huntington. Um, and of course, Burner Bob and all the folks over at the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange that helped me make this happen. So with that, I will open the floor for any questions or comments you might have.
All right, well, thank you very much, Eva. Yeah, the first comment in here, we do have some good questions and we're coming up on the time. So I put Eva's email address in the chat if anyone wants to reach out to her. Also, Melissa had indicated a very nice infographic that you had, and she may ask you for permission to use. So I've got the email in there that she can reach out to you. And then Judy asked, how was the light level in the greenhouse controlled?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also something we're actively working on. The light remains consistent for all the seedlings, so they are randomly distributed by treatment. So we just have a grid of them, and so we're hoping to abate any potential spatial autocorrelation, which is always a concern with greenhouse experiments, by making sure that there's not one treatment that's closer to a window or anything. But then there's some fancy grow lights up there that can be dimmed and brightened. And sadly, I've been trying to work with a greenhouse manager um, to figure out the lighting system. Right now, we have it just under full light, so it goes during the day and then it's off at night. But there is a way to program, so it's actually a specific amount of photons um, being given off by the lights. But that system, nobody knows how to use it, unfortunately. But we're working on it.
Thanks. Hope that answers your question, Judith. Another question here from Amanda, who's at the Mass Wildlife Muddy Brook WMA Wildlife Management Area. She's saying that that might be an interesting site to explore. Not sure how it would fit into your experiment design, but it'd be very cool to visit and possibly sample for presence of the mycorrhizal fungi.
Awesome.
And
Yeah,
it,
I'd love to come visit.
and then Shlomaya has a question or thoughts on how hot catastrophic fire versus light frequent surface fire affects the soil mycorrhizal communities.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, most of the research that's been done on fire effects on fungi has been out west. So folks will see that there's been a catastrophic wildfire and use that as an opportunity to sample some soil and then write up a paper on it. Whereas there's been much less research on how frequent low intensity fires affect communities, but I think it's going to be vastly different consequences, because with a catastrophic fire, it's a high severity, high intensity. So not only are there just higher surface soil temperatures, but the temperature and heat can penetrate lower, and will lead to a higher mortality of the fungi in general. and it will shift a lot of the fungal communities away from more later stage fungi towards these really quick colonizing fungi that we generally think might not be as beneficial to the trees. Um, but it's my hypothesis that these lower intensity fires leads to less direct effects on the fungi through mortality and more indirect shifts on fungal communities through interactions with nutrient availability. It's my long-winded response.
All right. And then I hope that answers your question, Shlomaya. Amanda's got a comment, not a question. We have much more complex herbaceous and shrub layers than ecosystems out west also. I wonder how these smaller plants interact with mycorrhizal fungi around tree roots.
That's a great comment and a great consideration because actually a lot of the forest understory plants associate with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. Um, and as I mentioned, those are more fire sensitive species associated with more fire sensitive trees. So I think fire could also kill off some of the understory um, and shift it towards understories and overstories that are more fire associated. For example, understories and more fire adapted areas in eastern forests tend to associate with ectomycorrhizal or ericoid fungi, which I didn't mention, but are cool and I think fire adapted.
All right, thanks for responding there. Eva, can I have you stop sharing your screen for just a second?
For sure.
And I'm gonna we're coming up on the top of the hour here, and I just wanted to share my screen for 1 second. Just wanted to mention that this was the last of our spring 2025 student webinar series. And if anyone uh, that's out there or you know of somebody that might be interested in participating, we will be having a fall 2025 student webinar series. So please reach out to me. There's my email address, ericevinson@nafchelp@gmail.com. If you want to learn more about the student webinar series, you can hit that QR code there and you can see some of the past presentations and recordings, or you can just, if you want to visit the NAFC website, you can also just go to firesciencenorthatlantic.org and get that information about what NAFC is all about. Otherwise, we're coming up on the top of the hour here, so I just want to thank you, Eva, for your informative talk. I was very appreciative today, and I'm very appreciative of all of you that joined us today as part of this student webinar series. So thank you all. We're going to keep it open for just another minute or two if anyone has any additional questions. Otherwise, again, thank you everybody for attending, and I hope to see you for the fall 2025 student webinar series. Thank you.